Hi there, and welcome to Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we are going to talk a little bit about the family and familial communication. We will go over the family life cycle. We'll also talk about communication patterns, which consist of conversational orientation and conformity orientation. Of course, we'll delve into these key terms. And then we'll end with some tips for some effective familial communication. This is a topic some of my students have asked for me to cover, especially as we go into the holidays. So I hope that some of this material resonates with you. Of course, if you haven't asked Dr. Shepard, always feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. This week, we're not going to have an Ask Dr. Shepard just because it is final season for me. So I am multitasking, but of course, as I always promise, we have a new episode every first and third Wednesday of the month. So I hope you enjoy this one. So when we think about the family life cycle, how families traditionally start, as we know, right? There are patterns that are unique and different compared to friendships and romantic relationships. Couples who do not have children may not necessarily go through all of these different stages, but they might go through other stages in their family life cycle. But the first and foremost is the establishment of a family. So this is where a couple settles into marriage or a cohabitating relationship, and they work on it. If you recall earlier episodes, we talk about this as kind of the navigation phase of their relationship. And it's more substantial than just dating, right? You've made a commitment, whether formal commitment, husband and wife, maybe you had a spiritual ceremony, maybe you decide that you both don't want to be married, but you're going to be cohabitating and quote unquote common law marriage. This, of course, is the first stage of any family life cycle. Then we have enlarging a family, and this is one of the major changes in many families' lives, and this is typically with the addition of a child. Though through the years of teaching this material, I always talk to my students, and I view, and I know other people view, pets, different animals that you domesticate as also potentially enlarging your family. And as I always tell people when they ask if I want to get a pet, and I'm like, well, a pet in my eyes is a child that never really grows up, right? They always are going to depend on you to feed them, to take them out if they're maybe a dog, to go to the bathroom, to clean their area, right? Their lives are always going to be 100% dependent on you. And with children, yes, especially in this day and age and economy, it seems as if we're seeing a lot of more boomerang families, is the kind of technical term, where families are multi-generational on the roof. The children maybe move back home with their parents, or the parents move in with the children. And that is very common to have these multi-generational families in a lot of other countries, but in the United States of America, it hasn't been as common. But I think we're seeing that grow even more. So, of course, I still think, though, pets could be envisioned as part of this second stage or phase of enlarging your family. Then, of course, the third aspect, and this is where the communication patterns that we'll discuss comes into play, is developing a family. And so this involves investing a great deal of time, thought, and energy in actually raising the children. And so this is, of course, where the interpersonal communication comes in, where we think about the communication patterns, which consist of kind of an axis. So it consists of conversation orientation, which is how opened or closed the communication is in the household. And then the other axis, the conformity orientation. So the extent to which family members are expected to adhere to family hierarchy and conform to their beliefs, aka the head of household, what they say goes. Do you have to do that, or are you allowed freedom and flexibility? So the first one, and is the one that I grew up in, I would argue, maybe my parents believe something else, but would be the consensual family communication pattern. And so in consensual families, there's high conversation and high conformity orientation. So within this, communication tends to have substantial depth and breadth. Parents encourage children to express their ideas and feelings, yet the parents expect and encourage children to adhere to the parents' values and beliefs. So I was allowed to talk freely, maybe not as freely as I always wanted to, but I still was allowed some freedom and some open communication. But ultimately, right, the conformity orientation, the expectations to adhere to their beliefs, their norms, their rules was also high. Somewhat similar but different on the conformity aspect is the pluralistic families communication patterns. And for pluralistic families, there's high conversation and low conformity. So, of course, here communication is going to be open. All family members are encouraged to express their thoughts and feelings, but they are not required or compelled to agree with the family. So I would say maybe my relationship with my parents has maybe moved more so into a pluralistic family communication pattern now that they have launched me as a child. But clearly growing up right under their roof, under their household, I was, I can't do everything I want to do or say everything I want to necessarily say outside the household, right? But I was conforming to that conformity orientation. But I did have a high consistency of the conversation orientation. So pluralistic on the flip side, right? You have that low conformity. So yes, you have the freedom to talk and say what you want and share your opinions. And you also have the freedom to not necessarily abide by the rules of your caregivers. After that, we have protective families. So this is low conversation and high conformity. So conflict is oftentimes avoided in these households, and children are expected to adhere to their parents' values and beliefs and decisions, which may therefore undermine open and honest communication between the parents and children. So the parents, because they feel this high pressure to conform to the norms, the values, the beliefs, and rules of their parents, are in the same kind of breath not granted the openness of communication. And because there are certain rules at play, certain norms, certain values, that might also hinder them feeling as if they can be honest and open. And then the last type of communication pattern would be the laissez-faire family communication pattern. And this has low conversation, but also low conformity. So this is oftentimes limited connections between members of the family. Parents and children have limited interactions and have independence. So I know growing up, I had some friends who their parents were very busy working a lot, and so they kind of raised themselves a bit, or would hang out with older siblings who would kind of raise them. So the parents kind of had maybe some say, but they weren't necessarily physically around because they were very busy, and therefore, of course, there's low conformity. We don't necessarily even know what the rules are. And of course, low conversation because they are not there. So people would probably argue that consensual family communication patterns and our pluralistic family communication patterns are going to be the quote unquote healthiest or ideal. Of course, anything with a high conversation orientation, I think, is going to be beneficial. The fact that your kids can feel safe to communicate, to share with you and or others about how they're feeling in your family. So whether that's your nuclear family, which is kind of the traditional parents and children, whether it's your blended family with maybe multiple adults, maybe multiple children, maybe adopted and or biological, also maybe single parent family household, right? Or even we have the term coming more into fashion, of course, due to this economic situation we're in, the commuter families, where usually for economic reasons, one or more family members is commuting, so they're not necessarily physically present for maybe prolonged periods of time. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you're aware of that, but this has definitely been a changing pattern. I know I watch a show called Married to Medicine, and one of the couples on there, the husband lives several hours away for most of the week where he works at a hospital, and he makes a lot more money. And so financially it made sense for them to do that, right? But therefore, one would then maybe think about, well, what are the communication patterns? And in the first episode that they had, you can kind of see that playing out, where the husband is back, the wife is kind of complaining a bit that he's not there to help raise the children. The children are there and they say they don't feel as if the father is there any less than he was when he was working closer, showing maybe that they have a high conversation orientation, right? There's this openness to communicate. One of the children interrupted the mom at one point, and she said that, women don't like being interrupted because it lets us know that it tells us or signals that you're not really listening to what we're saying. And the father kind of co-signed, right? So you could see this openness where there was this freedom to talk like that. And then the conformity orientation, right? Are they expected to or not? I would argue from watching the show that there is a high conformity. So they have maybe a consensual family communication pattern. If you watch that, that's up to your, shading. But clearly, as I was saying, with communication patterns, we're going to want a high conversation orientation. We want people in the family to feel as if they can express themselves. What we're seeing a lot more being discussed as people think about human rights, or that children also have human rights. And so what and how can we foster that? How can we foster their voice? How can we allow them a safe space to explore who they are and what they believe? And that, of course, is always going to come from a high conversation orientation. Now, the conformity orientation is clearly going to be up to the guidance of those parents, right? I would say I turned out pretty well being in a consensual family where there was a high conformity, and I would argue now we've transitioned to a lower conformity. And there are moments where my parents maybe try and compel me to do something, but ultimately, right, not being under their roof, right, we're not in a boomerang family. I can make the decisions I want to make. But when we're thinking about the family life cycle, right, this is where the majority and chunk of the time is spent, is in this third phase of developing a family. And of course, moving into the fourth phase is the encouraging of independence. And this is where the children seek greater autonomy from their families. This would be kind of those teenage years, those angst years, where I'm sure we all recall, if you can recall your teenage years, as I can clearly do, and recalling instances of butting heads where you feel as if you're quote unquote an adult and you want more adult responsibility and to be able to do adult things, and your parents are still looking at you as a child and also realizing that you're really not an adult even though you feel that way. And so it's that tug, that push and pull. And then moving out of that is that launching of the children, stage 5. And so this is a vital change for most families. And this happens when the last child usually leaves home for college, marries, or to live on their own. And so after this, the original inceptors of the family, right, have this post-launching of children phase, which happens after the departure of a child from the home, and the spouses have to redefine their marriage. And so this is sometimes where we've seen statistically that sometimes when it comes to divorce, it's kind of happening in this post-launch phase where the couples have drifted from each other, where their identities, right? We've talked on earlier episodes that we're all multifaceted individuals who wear different hats. And sometimes you can wear different hats at the same time, and sometimes you can't. And so that hat of parent/caregiver as well as spouse or partner is maybe sometimes a hat that people don't juggle as well. I know that some couples that have lasted long always talk about, they made sure they always had date nights, whether it was every month or every 2 weeks, or they did something romantic, or, it maybe doesn't sound sexy, but they made sure they scheduled time for sex or intimacy, right? This helped them nurture and maintain that spouse, that partner, that husband, that wife label that they had that wasn't subsumed by the parent label. And sometimes what happens is people get subsumed and consumed by that label, and they forget to nurture that aspect of their identity. And we can see that also with friendships, right? We can see that with any type of interpersonal relationship outside of that familial relationship, or maybe co-worker relationship, where so much is put into fostering, maintaining those relationships that these other relationships kind of wither a bit or fall off. So with post-launching, right, you're kind of redefining what your marriage looks like, who you are, what does life look like now that your children are establishing on their own. But what's become interesting about this sixth stage, as we're seeing with the economy, as I mentioned, is kind of this idea of the boomerang family. So yes, you launch these children, but they boomerang back and they maybe come move back in with you because the rent is too high, right? As people say, or, mortgage rates are insane, right? So where are they going to land? They get a job that can barely pay, as we're seeing more and more news stories talking about the cost of living, the average entry-level salary position doesn't even really cover the cost of living in the majority of places. So to save money, if they're fortunate enough and are able, right, they move back in with their parents. So how does that also then complicate that post-launching phase? And then eventually what comes, hopefully, though I know at least for my generation, maybe it doesn't seem likely, or the generations after us, is the stage 7 is retirement, being about further change in the family. It can either maybe be positive or negative. Were your parents able or fortunate enough to save enough money to maybe retire to a retirement community or to a new state that's, better for people who are becoming elderly? Are they able, do they have enough money to kind of survive, right? Or as we're seeing more and more stories coming out, unfortunately, due to our economic times, I keep harping on that, but that really does put stressors on all our interpersonal relationships. But for your family right now, maybe they thought they had enough money, but they're sick, they have drugs that they need to purchase, and so that's taking up a big chunk of their change. And so what does that mean? Does it mean now maybe I need to move my parent in with me? Am I able to do that? What do we have to figure out, right? So some potential positives, but also some negatives, and definitely some stressors for the overall family unit. And so when we think about all of that, clearly, communication is going to be vital to maneuver all of these stages. So the first tip or trick that I would tell you to do, and is something that I did with my own family, is you need to have kind of a restart conversation, quote unquote. So with the launching of the children, the post-launching of the children, right? My parents and I would butt heads a little bit at times because I felt as if they were still viewing me as a child, where I was growing into adulthood. And I would argue I'm fully in adulthood now. And so we had these resetting conversations, right? Like, well, what am I looking for in a parent at 20 whatever, at 30 whatever, right? How can we grow this relationship? What do I require? What am I asking for? On the flip side, what are they looking for? What are they asking for? Are there things that maybe I don't like that you've been doing? And can we address those? Can we figure out a way to compromise? So a famous example, I don't think he would mind me sharing, is my dad, when he would come over to my place, would go to the thermostat and change it and put home whatever temperature he wanted. And I was like, hey, I don't like that. When I come to your place, I don't just run to your thermostat and change it, even though I'm really hot. I always ask, hey, would you mind, turning it down a little bit, right? Anybody who knows me knows I love it to be cold, right? I like a little chill in the air at all times. I think you should still be able to have a blanket and curl up in the summer, right? So that means my place needs to be cold. So of course, right, my parents are always willing to do that, right? They'll compromise a little bit and put the AC on for a moment, and I'll get some relief, and we're fine, right? On the flip side, right, when they come to my place, they want me to inch on the heat. So what I've also done is I bought space heaters that they can literally put by them when they're here, so I'm not wasting my bill. But we were able to have a beneficial conversation to reorient our relationship to what it would need to be now. So those same scripts that we were using to help inform our relationship needed to change, because I wasn't a child anymore, right? I was a young man launching into adulthood. I, had bought a place, a homeowner, right? There are, of course, things that I still come to my parents for advice and suggestions. But as we even talked then, I'm coming to you for your advice because I know you've lived a longer life than I have. You have more lived experiences that I have yet to experience, or you have maybe a different viewpoint, and I respect that viewpoint. But ultimately, I'm still going to make the decision I want to make, right? And I know that used to frustrate my dad. Sometimes he'd be like, you come to me, we talk, and then you do something totally different. I was like, well, yes, I appreciated your insight, and I took it to heart, and then I decided to do this, right? And just talking it through, right, was able to alleviate some issues. I even know, and we'll get to this, how words, thoughts, and emotions can really color our relationships. Getting frustrated because my parents needed my help. They were out of town. And of course, I'm always obliged to do it, right? I love them. If whatever I can do to help, right? I try and do. And so it was something that was going to take time out of my day, right? I don't have a mode of transportation, so I had to go and get a mode of transportation in order to do this. I was also going to see a movie that night that was a limited premiere. It was kind of the Luther Vandross movie. Anybody who knows me knows I love that movie, right? And so what he was asking me to do was going to take an hour out of my day plus. And so I was like, sure, I'll do it, but I'm going to have to do it after the movie, right? So there was some frustration. And I just said, hey, let's take a step back. Let's talk about it, right? You want me to do X, Y, and Z, and you want me to do it your way. And if you were here, I know you would do it this way, and it would be good. You probably wouldn't even ask me for help, but you're not here, right? So you're asking me for help, and I'm willing to do it, but just because you're asking me to do it doesn't mean I'm going to do it on your time and or the exact way you're going to do it, right? But I will get it done and the results will be the same, right? We were able to have that conversation, and literally a 2-minute conversation alleviated all of kind of the angst on both ends of the phone, right? And alleviated the emotions that we were feeling. So I think it's always important to try and establish that conversation, right? So as I also previewed, right, the next tip, right, the first tip is, of course, have these reorienting relationship conversations when you're entering into these different phases. I think that really helps, and it's especially helped my relationship with my parents, right? I'm one of their little friends now because of that, right? And I always invite them anytime I do something with my friends. They're invited, and they oftentimes come, right? They're part of the crew. And I think we were able to get there successfully because of that reoriented conversation. And then the second tip, of course, is words, thoughts, and emotions always impact our views on our relationships. And so we know words impact relationships. So how we talk and behave towards each other influences our self-esteem and feelings about that relationship. So if I'm using negative words to describe the person that I am dealing with, that's a family member, if I continually use that, that is going to influence my thoughts, right? My thoughts refer to how we think about each other. So if I'm continually using negative valence words, I'm going to have negative thoughts about that person. And then, of course, my emotions, which we typically refer to how we feel based on what we say to others and what we communicate to ourselves through self-talk, right? If I'm saying negative words about someone, I'm having negative thoughts about them, my emotions to them are going to be negative as well. So if I'm trying to have a positive relationship with somebody, the words I use to describe them or talk about them probably need to be more positive. Or in certain situations, trying to be neutral as best you can be, right? So I know even with, certain family members, right, I'm well aware of the words I use, right? Whether positive, negative, or neutral, right? And if it's neutral, it's more so indifferent or open to what it could be, right? Positive, clearly having a relationship or trying to foster a positive relationship. And negative, clearly I'm not interested, right? And the ship has sailed on that. And so I think that, of course, is a really important tip. And then the third and final tip is really something I've learned from my students throughout the years of teaching, right? If I can believe it or not, I've been a Dr. Shepard for almost 10 years. I've been teaching for longer, right? So what I've learned from my students and what I appreciate about this younger generation is, we talk about all these different interpersonal relationships in my course and our shall not rules or behaviors that other people do, right? Platonically, romantically, sexually, that we don't tolerate. But then when it gets to family, we're taught, and generationally, right? I've had this conversation with my mother especially. We're kind of taught, oh, well, your blood, your family. So, wow, if someone did this to me and they were a friend, it would be justified cutting them off. Oh, well, they're family, so I should allow. And my students have taught me throughout the years, well, why would I allow negative behavior from someone just because we have blood when I wouldn't tolerate or allow that behavior from someone who I didn't, right? And so I've used that as a litmus test for myself for some relationships, familial relationships. And I stand by it, and I appreciate my students for pushing and fostering that, because I think that is ethical and effective communication, right? If I'm not going to tolerate somebody lying on me, right? If they were a friend, I would cut them off. Why would I tolerate a family member lying on me? And so, of course, it's much easier to make those moves and decisions when you are not reliant on the family, right? So we have to be mindful and aware, right? Children aren't probably going to be able to do that, unfortunately. Even they do deserve the right not to have relationships with people who are not invested in them or not treating them in a respectful manner. right? But unfortunately, under the current systems that we exist in, right, it's probably not going to work out. But when you are an adult and you are fostering or trying to maintain these relationships, you don't have to, right? If someone really treats you negatively or horribly, right, it's okay to walk away. And I think that's something that the younger generation, I think, does a really good job of establishing their boundaries and following through with that. So I would say those would be the tips to think about and to marinate on as we enter and continue this holiday season, where you're probably going to be around family members a lot more than you usually are. That kind of end of November, beginning of January phase. I don't know about you, but it was typically when I would be around family the most. And so if you are around your family, right, biological or even chosen, right? We haven't talked about chosen family that much, but we'll probably talk about that on a later episode. Hopefully some of these tips, right? These 3 tips particularly can help you maneuver your conversations or maneuver your feelings about particular family members. And of course, thinking about our own upbringing through the family life cycle can maybe shed some light on why we are the way we are, right? There's whole books written on how your family, right, the emotionally immature parents, right, can wreak quote unquote havoc potentially on their children, right? So even just reflecting on our communication patterns, how did that make me to be the person I am today? Am I open with discussion? Am I not? Do I require conformity? Do I not, right? For me, I know, even though I was going to require conformity with my own friends, right? We talk about it, one of my best friends, right? I won't call her out by name, but she kind of has this rule where if she's not messing with anybody, this person, you're done, right? That's her loyalty test. And for me, I'm like, that to me doesn't work, right? I follow that with her and the people I've met through her, but there are people I don't mess with, right, anymore, who she still engages with. And I don't have a problem with it because I know, because of how close we are, that I have nothing to worry about, right? She's not going to be bad-mouthing me to this person. This person is bad-mouthing me. I'm sure she will shut it down or say, hey, I'm not interested in hearing that. That's my very close friend. You talk about it with somebody else if you want to, right? Even though I feel like I'm too grown. People who don't like me, but also don't have any contact with people that I enjoy. But I hope, thinking about these things, right, and going back to that, right, so I have the low conformity. We'll talk about that stuff, right, but I'm not requiring it, where she maybe has a higher tolerance for that. But even through our friendship, I've seen her slowly but surely maybe change her viewpoint or understanding. Because for me, if I don't like somebody or someone has done me wrong and I no longer decide to engage with them, it doesn't mean that you have to cut them off, in my point of view, if they're adding something beneficial to your life. Right. And that's how I've always looked at it. So even though we have high conversation in all of my close interpersonal relationships, where I'm not holding my tongue back, I really do have low conformity with a lot of things. Now, of course, maybe some political stances, of course, that's not something I have a low conformity orientation towards. And those that are closest to me know what those categories are, of course. But I think that is where we will wrap it up today. I want to thank you all, of course, for listening throughout this first season and year of the podcast. If you can believe it or not, this is our 25th episode, right? Every other Monday and Friday, or first and third, I should say. And our last episode will be in just a few weeks. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, if you do have any Ask Dr. Shepards, feel free to send them to offthedataprovided@gmail.com. I'm going to do a few on the next episode as kind of our year wrap up. And I hope to hear you and see you on the next one. Bye-bye.